the title of it was going to be, and is today, Imperfect Church. And I think that if you've been around New Walk long enough, you know that we certainly embrace an understanding that we are imperfect. For the history of our church, we have made it that this is a safe place. If you're struggling in your life, you're going through something, hey, welcome to New Walk Church. It's okay to be here if you're not okay. I think probably some of the reason why the last 10 days has had so much love in it. I've never been more proud to be the pastor of our church, but the love that we've experienced amongst through one another over the last 10 days, I think the reason it happens is because we understand, none of us have it all together, and we're all going through a journey, and we're all dealing with struggles. You know, the outside world says things about church and hypocrisy and that we're messed up, but at New Walk, we're like, tell us something we don't know. We knew it already. And we never claimed to be perfect. A few weeks ago, I was having a little bit of fun with this, bringing us to this baseline that we're all messed up. You were probably here, and I kind of said, have you ever broken this commandment and this commandment? And we were all kind of having a little fun with that and raising our hands. To kind of deal, though, with the imperfect church, I want to just kind of come back to that baseline again here for just a minute. Maybe we'll do it a different way, but let's say you've ever made the mistake of speeding. I'm going to ask you in just a second to show your hands if you've ever gotten a speeding ticket, but I thought maybe what I would do is let's elevate it a little bit. Let's talk to those. Let's get a hand raised for those of you who didn't just get a speeding ticket, but you got one because you were blowing through the speed limit really, really big. Anybody want to admit that? I got my hand up. Woo! Oh my goodness, New Walk. Okay, put your hands down. I remember one time, the last time this happened for me. I had my girls in the car. They were pretty young. We were in another town. Took them out, I think, to get some coffee and some snacks or donuts or something one morning in this other town, and driving through town, I'm oblivious to the speed limit, and we got some Christian rap we're listening to, we're having a good time in the car with the kids, and probably at some point on the journey, I was doing 2 miles an hour over, then 5, then 10. You don't realize it, 15 miles an hour over, and all of a sudden, here come the lights flashing, And now, my kids are having this moment where it seems, well, Dad's not as perfect as they thought. And so then the lights, I got to explain, well, the officer just wanted to talk to me and visit with me today. But, I got to explain to him honestly really what was actually happening. And I have to tell you, I didn't wake up that morning thinking, I know here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go out and get in the car, and I'm going to drift into this speeding ticket that was so extreme, right? Somewhere on the journey of that drive, it increased, and it increased, and it increased. And I think my speeding story, and maybe your speeding story, is maybe also a portrait of sometimes our spiritual story. Nobody wakes up in the morning and goes, okay, I think here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to drift for a long time away from God. It's a slow, right? It's a slow journey and increase away from God. How do we find ourselves as church people dealing with our imperfections? Most every single time those imperfections are occurring because we're making decisions slowly on a journey away from God in our life. And so we make these decisions that are unhealthy. Here's what I wrote, though, in my notes. It'll be in yours as well. We'll put it up on the screen. The believers, that's the church, we've always been and will be imperfect on this side of eternity. However, knowing that we will always be imperfect does not absolve us from recognizing our need to continue towards righteousness. So here's what I mean. We can't just say as church people, we're imperfect, so, eat it. That's just the way we're always going to be. Okay, yes, we're going to be imperfect, but then what do? We identify those imperfections. God calls us out on those things that maybe we're drifting away from Him on in our life, and He says, hey, come back to me. let's deal with this in your life. And I think that's how the church can shine even more, is because we have a recognition when we're getting it wrong as church people and believers, and we can go towards that place of the right way of living in our life. The unbelieving person, I put this in my notes, they're also imperfect, but they are also not absolved from the need to recognize the importance of righteousness. The difference is, as believers, we have the equipping, we have the ability to identify those struggles again and go back to God, be healed. But again, I don't think anybody wakes up, I'm strong with Jesus. I was last night when I went to bed, but I wake up in the morning and now I'm just so far away from God. Nobody really does that. We understand over time, over history, some of you have experienced in your life, I have this, that it does begin to be this journey or this drift, and days turns into weeks, and weeks turn into months, and months can turn into years. We wonder sometimes about that feeling of distance from God, and we know God didn't move, and so what steps have we maybe at times been taking away from God? God has some steps, very clear, to come back home to Him in any area of your life. And so as a believer, I know it's very tempting to maybe put a lens on this topic of other people, or maybe even the events of the last 10 days. You might want to put that lens over it. And I don't think that's really helpful. I think it would be good for all of us to hear what I'm saying as we deal with Imperfect Church and say, what is the lens for my life, right? Because what did Jesus remind us of? He said, before you go worrying about the speck of dust in somebody else's eye, deal with the plank in your own. And so we have to take it personally for ourselves in our own time of self-examination and reflection. And so I put in your notes, I'm going to go through these steps. In our imperfections as believers, we have a need to, even as unbelievers have this need too, but we have a need as believers, and I want to give you these steps. Now, let me set it up here real quick. We're going to be in Luke chapter 2 in a very unique part of the scriptures where we get a glimpse, only in Luke, about kind of a middle portion of Jesus' life at age 12. All right, so if you know anything about the Bible, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, 2 of those books we get information about Jesus' birth. All of those books, we get information about Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, but in only one of those books, Luke, do we get a little information about the middle of his life. Remember, his ministry took place, started recording a lot of his ministry works in the Gospels at around age 30. But we get a little glimpse in between birth and age 30 at age 12, and so that's kind of where we're going to be during this time. And so I wrote this, here's step 1, and then we'll get into the scripture. Step 1 is you have to recognize when Jesus is missing in any area of your life. Recognize when Jesus is missing. Let's go to Luke 2, and let me help you kind of see what it is I'm trying to bring to your attention here. Verse 41. Every year, here's what it says. Every year, Jesus' parents, who is that? Mary and Joseph, we know that, went to Jerusalem for the feast of the Passover. And so this would be like, we're making that trek, making that journey every year. So, we load the kids in the minivan and, we got Jesus. They probably got Dora the Explorer on or something like that on DVD in the back seats of the minivan. And so the kids are loaded up and the family's loaded up and they're making their way on this pilgrimage that they go on every year. When Jesus was 12 years old, they went up to the feast according to the custom. For 12 years, the family made this pilgrimage every year to celebrate the Passover. I'll talk more about the Passover briefly in just a moment. For your mindset and understanding the Passover, this feast, this important time for the Jewish people, just think Christmas and Easter combined. All right, that's how big of a deal this is to the Jewish community. Now, before I talk more about that scripture, what I've come to understand in my years of ministry is that people confuse information with transformation. We talk about it all the time here at our church. You can get a lot of information, but that doesn't mean you have transformation. I want to just be clear as I give you the thinking filter for what we're talking about here today and making it very personal. There are a lot of people who come to church and they get information. They come all the time, but there's not a real transformation in their life. So two very different things. How do I know that's real? I can look at it just in the text that we're about to read a little more of here in our time together. Did Mary and Joseph understand who Jesus was? Well, in a lot of ways, they had more information about Jesus than anybody on planet Earth. Remember, the angel of the Lord came and gave information to Mary and Joseph and said, here's the deal. You're going to have a baby, and your baby is going to be God, the Messiah. Now, they would have understood as Jewish people what the implications of that is, the Messiah. They would have understood who the Messiah was, and that's promise for all of humanity that the prophets had said would be to come one day. And so they knew this information. They had all kinds of inside scoop, inside baseball, as you might say, of who this Jesus really was. They had all the information about Jesus, and yet as we go through this text, we'll see some of the mistakes that are made. The Passover, I mentioned it before. The Jewish community celebrates the Passover. I'll just say it as simply, Cliff Notes as I can. When they left Egypt, right, this plague was given to the people of Egypt that would be. It was the Passover of the angel of death in this plague, and that if you were Jewish, on that night, if you would have painted on your doorposts the sacrificed, pure blood sacrifice of the lamb on your doorpost, that blood, the angel would pass over your home. And right, he did that night. The Jewish people were spared. They were able to then leave. They go across the Red Sea. They, heading towards the promised land. And so this beautiful portrait of pure blood covering the Jewish people. Well, what did Mary and Joseph have in Jesus? They had the promise for all of humanity. Ultimately, it would be Jew and Gentile, that for any of us, we could accept the pure blood sacrifice. We call that, that's why we sometimes call Jesus the Lamb, that he was a final pure blood sacrifice for all of humanity. And that for any of us who accept that shed blood on the cross, on the doorpost, maybe not physical doorposts of our home, but the doorposts of our heart, right? We have salvation and we are saved from death because of Jesus. And so that is who they had at 12 years old, and they had the information about it. They had the information about Jesus. That's who's in their midst. Verse 43, after the feast was over, while his parents were returning home, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but they were unaware of it. Don't miss this. Hold on now. They take him to the feast. They get there. They leave him there, and they lose him. God says, I'm going to give you the Son of God. 12 years later, God shows back up and says, where's my son? Oh, we lost him. We lost God. Look, I think maybe this will be a therapeutic for some of us parents who've made mistakes over the years. Like, this is kind of the equivalent of leaving your kid in Walmart. And you're like, you don't even realize it. And so I don't want to cast any judgment here. There's some of y'all, maybe something close to this has happened in some way or another. But, we don't always get it right as parents. And let's be honest, right? We can be distracted in things at times. And there can be things that, just catch our attention. We didn't mean for it to, so we can have a little bit of a feeling and pain for what Mary and Joseph might be going through here. But here's the point I wanted to make here at the very beginning. Anytime you leave Jesus behind in your life, it leads to problems. And so I'm asking you to kind of filter through this morning, where is Jesus missing in some area of my life? Where have I left him behind? Because this happens a lot. I don't know, I think you maybe realize this in the United States of America today. There are many people, and they come into the doors of the church, and they're worshiping God, right? But what do when they head out the doors of the church? They go back to this other way of living. What are they actually doing when they're not really living for God? They're leaving Jesus behind in their life. This happens all the time. Oh, we're at church, but then Jesus is missing when we get back home. Again, information doesn't equal transformation. And so we have to have an awareness in our life where Jesus might be missing, maybe where we're drifting in some area. Sometimes we can be so unaware. I remember going to the gym one time, and I was on the treadmill, and there was a guy next to me on the treadmill, and he's got his phone, and he's browsing and swiping, doing all these stuff on his phone. And you know, here's ultimately what happened to this guy. He started drifting to the left. Didn't know he was drifting. One foot got caught on the side of the treadmill, and the other one got caught, stayed on the treadmill, and he flew. And his phone flew, his earbuds, it flew. He didn't wake up that morning, right, saying, oh, I can't wait to go to the gym and fly off the treadmill. But in a moment in time, he starts drifting and drifting. He was unaware. And I think that happens in our own life. We start to move. We start to take steps away from God. Over the years as a pastor, I've watched this take place. How do we find ourselves in these decisions that lead us into unhealthy living? I've given examples over the years. I kind of compiled all of them together. It's the man who's chasing his career. And you know, he's been plugged in at church. He really is. He's plugged in at church. His family's plugged in at church. His wife, it means so much to them. But, you know, there's a $20,000 raise that he could get somewhere else in some other city. And so he uproots his family and they go somewhere else. And they don't get plugged in. And they don't have the same rich church connection that they had that helped support them and move them. And so one weekend turns into 2 weekends, right? And 3, and then 4. And then all of a sudden they're on this drift, and maybe they're a little bit unaware of it, but it's happening. It's the single woman, and I've shared this many times over the years. Hey, single woman, don't date a guy who doesn't love Jesus. Because you have your number one love in your life is Jesus, and he doesn't want anything to do with the number one love in your life. But you're lonely, and I understand that can happen. And, you know, so you want to date, and you say, but it's just one date. And then one date turns into 2 dates, and 3 dates, and 4 dates. And all of a sudden you're with somebody and getting entrenched in a life where this person doesn't have not even close to the same values as you. And it becomes more difficult for you to kind of get away in this situation because of your entrenchment in this drift that you were a part of. Here in Florida, it's the Sunshine State. And we got a lot of things we can do on the weekends, right? We can go to the beach, we can go camping, we can go to the lake, we can water ski. It's like all kinds of things we can do. And you know, it's just one weekend, and we went to the beach, which is really great. But it's really cool. So it's the next weekend, and then it's the next weekend. We're not at church. We're not entrenched in the church. We were, but we just kind of started drifting a little bit more. No more small groups, no more Bible studies, no more accountability. And then all of a sudden, that drift turns into an all-out sprint away from God. We didn't wake up saying, oh, I want to run from God. We got on a slow journey away, day in and day out. I've seen parents who forsake the value of the community of believers in the church for sports. Their 8-year-old, they think he's going to be in Major League Baseball. And so they used to be in church. I want to just be clear. There's some people in our church that get this right. They do things on the weekends for their kids' sports, but they're still worshiping and serving. And so we have many of those. Like they work and they fight for that. But it's just one weekend, and then it's 2 weekends, and then it's 3, and then all of a sudden that rich connection for their child and for their family, it's gone. Hey, let me tell you, it's the longtime believer that used to serve. You used to serve. But now you don't serve. You used to invite people and evangelize, share your faith, but you don't do that as much. But you still love to come to church, and you love to come here, and you love to worship, and you get like that's big to you. It's a really big deal, but you're failing on one of the 2 great commandments. You're like, I love you, God, but you're not loving others. You didn't set out to do that, but it's missing in your life. Mary and Joseph were in a place where they did not hear Jesus' voice. They did not see his face. They did not experience his presence, but they figured as they left and headed back home, he must be among us somewhere. And this would have been a large group making the pilgrimage. And so he's probably behind us somewhere with the family. He's probably behind us somewhere with the relatives, right? And this is what we do in Christianity today. Instead of following Jesus, hear me, instead of following Jesus, we make our own plans and we hope that Jesus is somewhere behind us following us. And this is how we get into messy situations. Maybe he's back there somewhere. Maybe I can go on a walk away from Jesus, but somehow he'll follow me along the way. And we can walk and walk and walk further and further, and here's what we all know. The more we do that, the more pain that we can experience in a life living like that. But we don't see it. We're not aware that it's happening. But here's the second thing I put in your notes. Step 2, simple. Come back to Jesus. In the theological world, we would call this repentance. I'm heading down a road. I've left Jesus behind in my life. I need to go back to him. I need to come back home to God. Now, here's the challenge with this. For all of us, I've gone through it, you've gone through it. In the spiritual realm, in order for you to go back to Jesus, whatever it is, the road you were going down, you're probably going to have to let go of something that was important to you in your flesh so that you can experience more of Jesus. There's always a sacrifice that you're going to have to make in your flesh to go back home to Jesus. This is where the real challenge takes place. Let's put it down out of the supernatural. Let's bring it down into the natural, right? Let's say you wanted to live healthier, right, in your life, the things you eat. You're going to have to change. You're going to have to sacrifice some things. I've shared over the years some of my vices with food. I put a compilation of all of them here for our time together today. Some of you have been around long enough. I've shared on the stage that I love Dairy Queen Blizzards, right? I love them, and I don't just want the large. I want the extra large with the extra stuff. And so when I'm doing full on, sugar eating, like this is the way I go. And don't give me a 24-ounce drink or a 32-ounce. I want the 44 gulp guzzler, whatever it is, because that's kind of the way I roll. I've shared over the years, I love Reese's peanut butter cups. Yeah. But I can't eat just one or two. I'll just go one after the other after the other. I've shared with you over the years, I like Little Debbie's, but I won't just eat one Little Debbie. Give me the whole box. I'm going to eat the whole box. People have eaten pancakes with me before, and I don't just want 2 or 3 pancakes. Give me 4 or 5 flooded in syrup. Like that's the way, if I'm not paying attention, that's the way this thing will go. But some people who know me know that a long time ago, I had to make a decision that those sugars were a problem for me, and I had to walk away from it. And so I made a sacrifice of that so that I could live healthier and have better, healthier outcomes in my life. Okay, I'm going to leave that there. Let's go back to the text, verse 45. When they did not find him, Jesus, they went back to Jerusalem to look for him. Don't miss this. They went back to Jerusalem, the place where they left him. And isn't it interesting that they went back to the place where ultimately Jesus would be sacrificed one day, Jerusalem? They went to the place of sacrifice to find Jesus. And it reminds me that for you and I to experience coming back home to God, there is something I am going to have to let go of. It always requires sacrifice, and people don't want to make that sacrifice. And so they stay heading down this unhealthy road. Dealing with our imperfections, I put this in your notes, will always require sacrifices. And I meet so many people that want change in their life, but they are not willing to sacrifice to experience more of God. We have one of the causes to a separation from Jesus in our mind and our heart. It's oftentimes this thing that's in the way that's keeping us from experiencing more of Jesus this morning. What is it that God is calling you to deal with in your own personal life that you may have to let go of in order to experience more of him? Verse 46. After how many days? After 3 days, oh my goodness, 3 days, they found him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to them, asking them questions. Everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. It's interesting where they found him. In the temple courts, he's there. He's talking with people about the Messiah. And he's like, oh, and by the way, I'm the Messiah. So that's got to be some interesting conversation. But during that time, exclusively, where did the work of God take place during that time? It took place at the temple. Where did the people go exclusively for their worship of God? They went to the temple. They're in the same town looking for Jesus. Jesus is in the temple, but apparently it took them a lot of time to go around town to find him. They're searching for him. They finally find him in the temple courts after a bit. They were so close to him, yet for a period of time, they still had not located him and connected with him. And that brings me to this place. And again, I'm reminded of this in my own spiritual journey, right? It's one thing to be near to Jesus. It's another thing to be fully in his presence. And that brings me back to this place. There's a lot of people that can come to church, and be near, right? There are some people amongst us, maybe right here. You've come to church for 30 years, 20 years, 10 years. You get near to Jesus, but you've never decided to surrender in obedience to a life of Jesus Christ, a life that follows Jesus Christ. There are others of you've been coming here, you have made that decision in your life. But right now, there's a part of your life where you haven't allowed Jesus to fully encounter, be involved in immersing your life into this area with him. And when we're not willing to sacrifice, we start playing a game. And I've joked about this publicly over the years as I've tried to eliminate sugars. I've joked about things, but sometimes people will sometimes I'll give this little example because I've heard people do this negotiating in the spiritual realm. All right, so let's just say you do have a problem with Reese's peanut butter cups like I do, and you saw something like this pot of gold. Yeah, isn't that beautiful? Now, when I see that, I think, okay, I'd like to eat that, but I just can't. It's not good for me. I can't, because again, I can't stop at one. So I have a problem there. So I just kind of, okay, but I could, I guess, try to play a little game with this. And maybe some of you have done this. And here's the game. I'll eat a Reese, but have a Diet Coke. We laugh about that, right? Like if I eat all of this, but I have a Diet Coke, does it cancel out? And so we joke about that and we laugh about that. But spiritually, I know people who do this. Let me tell you what it looks like. My boyfriend and I were having sex outside the bounds of marriage together, but we're going to do Bible study together. Pastor Gary, I know what the scriptures say about tithing, and I'm not going to do that, but I'll serve more. We play a game with it. And I just wrote this in my notes, and so here it is. Radical disobedience in one area of your life does not get excused by radical obedience in another area of your life. We have to decide to address that situation, that imperfection, and say, God, I'm going to take this serious so that I can experience you and the promises to experience him even more. Here's the third thing I put in your notes. Find restoration. And it's available. It requires you owning up to the situation, being honest with God. He already knows, right? We call that confession. He already knows your struggle, but you are going to come into agreement and stop denying it and realize there's an area that needs to be sacrificed, brought to the altar of God so that you can move forward. I go sometimes over the years as a pastor, I've gone to court appearances for families in the church who are going through something, and I've sat with them for, during that time. Sometimes you'll go to the courthouse and there'll be, the judge is doing this thing and all, he'll have other cases on the docket before yours comes up to be heard. And when you sit there long enough, you hear people say, and it comes across really silly. When you hear some of the things going on, they'll say, it's not my fault, Judge. The other person's to blame. They're the one responsible. You see it over and over again. People don't want to assume the responsibility for the situation. And so it does require us to find that restoration, to say, okay, God, I'm ready to come before you with this situation. I'm ready to bring it to you. I want to deal with that area of my life. Let's go on here and see how God treats this situation through Jesus' life and what he would want you to know right now in your own life. Verse 48, when his parents saw him, they were astonished. Look at this. Mary gets mad at Jesus. Check it out. His mother said to him, son, why have you treated us like this? And Jesus has got to be thinking, who walked away from who? You're blaming me. Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you. They're blaming Jesus. If you had never walked away, people, that none of this would have ever happened. We wouldn't even be here today. And again, if you want to choose to walk away from God's umbrella, his provision, his protection, you can do that. And even under his umbrella, we're not immune from some of the things of this broken world. But when we walk under that umbrella of protection, we are able to not experience some of the other hurts that we would have experienced had we chosen to walk outside of his coverage in our life. But I'm interested in this text because I look at it, Jesus could have been ticked. He could have sat down. Sit down right here, Mary. Sit down here, Joseph. We're going to have a talk. You're up here blaming me. Let's have a little bit of conversation about all of your faults. You know what? Really, you all messed up. You had one job on earth to do as a parent. Keep track of God, and you missed it. That was what's wrong with you? And Joseph, you want to be the head of the household and be a real man of God, and you can't even keep track of me. He doesn't do that. Not at all. Verse 49. Why were you searching for me? He asked. Didn't you know that I had to be in my father's house? But they did not understand what he was saying to them. They went down to Nazareth with them, and look at what Jesus, he was obedient to them as a child would be to parents. But his mother treasured all these things in her heart, and Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and favor with God and with men. I think sometimes we think when we come home to God, he's going to scream at us. He's going to point a finger. You're a terrible person. Look at all the things that's not what we see here. Over and over in the scriptures and the nature of God, when we decide to come home and find restoration, he's not screaming at us. He's saying, okay, welcome. You see your struggle. God's already seen it. You see it now. And he wants you to come home to him. He knows all of our stupid and foolish things we've done, but are we willing to admit it and say, God, I need your help right now in my life? I put in my notes and in your notes 2 things I think Jesus, his parents, and us have in common. As I see the way Jesus deals with his parents, the way he would speak to us right now in the year 2024, he would say this to you and I: I'm not mad at you. This is not a God is going to get you situation. I just want you to come back home. And the second thing I think he would say to you and I is, let's move forward. You had some missteps, but there's plenty of life in front of you. There's plenty of amazing opportunity. You have potential. You have incredible purpose. Your life has meaning. Your life has value. Oh, you think it doesn't have value now because of some of the mistakes that you've made? No, your value is still there. This $100 bill, as it's here in my hand, currency-wise, what is the dollar value of a $100 bill? It's $100. But if I were to subject it to chaos by wadding it up, if I was to crumple it up and for days and days step on it and step on it and step on it and then finally pick it back up and open it back up and do this and present it to you like I'm presenting to you right now, what is the value of this $100 bill? Still $100. And there are some of you, where you are right now here today, you've been through some things, and you've been through some trials, and you've been through some struggles, and some of them you brought on by your decision making. And what God says, if you will come home to him, is I'm going to show you, you still have full value to me. You mean so much to me. I want to show you that you are still valuable to me. Let's move forward in that value. I want to pray for you now. God, there's unbelievers here. There's believers here. There's believers who are identifying right now an area that Jesus is missing in their life. And it's not about cancellation, it's about sacrifices. God, I want to let go of something in my flesh so I can come back home to you. I'm here. I'm at the place of sacrifice right now, God. And ready to leave it here. Move forward with you. God says, yeah, let's go. I'm going to bring a new presence, a fresh new wind in that spirit of your life, that area of your life that you've been hiding me and running from me. And there's maybe an unbeliever here. You got information, but it's time for transformation. And the fact is look, you're here as an unbeliever. The road you're headed down, it doesn't get any prettier. It gets messier. It just does. 100 out of 100, it gets messier. But you can come home, just like I did all the years ago when I sat in church. I decided to come home. I didn't want to go down that road any longer in my life. I wanted to see the value that my Creator had for me. I wanted to know the plans and designs. And I said, God, I just want to come home to you. God says, just like He did for me, He says to you this morning, I'm welcoming you in. I'm welcoming you home. God says, I want to embrace you, but I need you to receive the gift of my Son, Jesus Christ. He did indeed become that final pure blood sacrifice for humanity, that for all who accept that gift and that pure blood sacrifice, they have the covering over their heart for the salvation of their sin through the gift of Jesus Christ. You can say, God, I am ready to accept that gift of forgiveness today offered on the cross through your Son. I'm ready to turn towards you. I want to leave my old life and ways behind and move towards you now and begin a journey with you. In Jesus' name, amen.